Welcome, everyone. My name is Mike Molesky, and I'm today's host for John's weekly Town Hall series. The topic of today's discussion will be Freedomfest. John will be spending most of the hour answering your questions on
Supreme Court, but I'll mention that in a little bit later. But the arbitrariness that we've talked about in previous town halls, and even with some of his own personal behavior with going out into rallies and protests. So I think really, if we want to open the PA economy, and it has opened up to a certain degree, but there still needs to be more done. I think, and you've heard me talk about this in a number of other town halls, that if we simply follow the CDC guidance and work very hard to protect the vulnerable and open up, that's the best scenario. And I will just remind you, if you weren't on some of those earlier town halls, my personal experience, now going on 4 months, is by following the CDC guidance and being intelligent about it, which does not necessarily include wearing masks all the time. In fact, it does not. If you follow those guidelines, you can successfully navigate through this COVID-19 crisis. We stand today, 4 months into this, the company that I work for, over 2,000 people in 7, 8, 10 states, as well as 3 or 4 countries in Europe and India. We still have not had one case of COVID-19. So it just underscores the fact that it can be done, and it doesn't have to be done by arbitrary decree. So I'll leave it at that right now. And but then the other thing that happened on this regard this week was the Supreme Court decision to side with Governor Wolf's look at his stance of being able to keep this power. And I think that the only point I want to make here, because we predicted it several weeks ago, they picked the court that had, in essence, was best represented with Democrats. And shocker, news alert, how do you think they came down? They came down on the side of Governor Wolf. That's no big surprise. I think realistically, we will continue to see this kind of behavior all the way through to November. Why? Well, because I truly believe it, for a long time now, it hasn't been about safety. It hasn't been about people's security. It's been about politics. And we'll continue to see that for the next 4 months, unfortunately. And at the same time, people in Pennsylvania will continue to be hurt by these policies. So enough of that. I want to go on to the second one. One of the primary message that I've been talking about now since last September, and it's really crystallized in 3 words. It's about security, freedom, and opportunity. All the things I talk about ultimately boil down to security, freedom, and opportunity. The other disturbing thing that we continue to see in this country is the lawlessness. That lawlessness continues. One thing that you see, though, in the last couple of weeks, you don't see it as widely reported in the media. Why not? Well, they know that it has become more and more of a concern and more of a negative amongst the American people. So while it continues on, and they tend to support it underneath, they're reporting it less and less, so it becomes less and less visible to us. But in fact, it does continue. And what we're continuing to see are evidences of anarchy and chaos, and that agenda, which basically fuels the fundamental transformation agenda that we hear about. That's what we have to fight. We have to fight it every day in every way we can, because the type of fundamental transformation that they're talking about really is one of a Marxist agenda. And I won't go too deeply into this one because there may be questions about it in the Q&A. And quite honestly, there's enough material here for a whole separate town hall. But I think the bottom line is that this lawlessness must stop. We need to have a return to law and order. Security is one of the most basic human needs that we all have. And when we don't have that security, it creates a high degree of anxiety and angst. So we call on the governors, we call on the mayors to get that under control, to restore law and order. We need it as a country, we need it as individuals, and there's no reason why it should be allowed to continue on and on. But again, we may continue to see it until November, because again, the agenda is not about safety and security. Unfortunately, everything has to be politicized, and I think that's what we're looking at is people posturing and, quite frankly, turning it into political leverage. So I just wanted to touch on those two things because they're very important. They continue to boil and bubble, and we need to get beyond that. But that's, as I said, that's fodder for a whole nother session, which we likely will have here shortly. And with that, I think what I will do, keeping true to what we promised, is I will pause here and turn the podium back over to Mike to see what questions have come in, and we'll dive into the Q&A.
Thank you, John. I guess the first question I have here, I guess, speaks to the COVID-19 outbreak, the origins of it, and it's people are talking about holding China accountable for their actions that I guess exacerbated and led to this situation that we're currently in. Do you agree that China needs to be held accountable, and how would you go about doing that?
Okay. Yes, I would say categorically yes, they need to be held accountable, especially if, there's been many stories, many reports about things that they did, which tend to suggest that they knew about the strength of the virus, and yet they didn't respond responsibly. So I think we need to hold them accountable. I think it gets tricky as to how to hold them accountable, but I would say that there's at least three things that we should be thinking about and working on. Number one, you've heard a little bit about this, but it needs to have more discussion. One, if we have the evidence that they either hid things or did things even overtly. For example, we all know that they basically banned air travel from Hunan province, where the virus started, to Beijing because they knew how serious this was, and yet they didn't stop travel from Hunan to the rest of the world. So if those evidences are there, and I truly believe there is, and if we have the legal standing, and I think we would, I think one of the things we need to look at is holding back or nationalizing some or all of the debt of our debt that they hold today. In essence, that would be a payment or partial payment to the injuries that they inflicted on us and perhaps other parts of the world. But I think we need to look seriously at that as, is there the legal standing to do that? And if so, what do we feel the damages really are? And then put that into action. I think the second thing, which actually is better for us and would be more impactful to them, is to work very hard and provide the incentives to bring businesses, companies, plants, manufacturing, bring that back to the United States. If we do that, you get a double benefit. One, it weakens them because that's their engine for generation of funding that they use to extend themselves around the world. So if we did that, that would in essence weaken them, but at the same time, it would strengthen us because we would strengthen our supply chains, we would have a broader tax base here, we would have more opportunity, more jobs for our own American people, etc. So I think we need to do that regardless, but by doing that, that in essence holds them accountable and weakens them. And then the third one, it's a little abstract, but I think we need to be much harder on them regarding intellectual property. We have been very lax over many years in standing by while they acquired the intellectual property. We all know that in most cases it was stolen in one way, shape, or form. How does that hurt them? Well, think about if the way that they have been acquiring that costs them very little. If they had to develop that intellectual property themselves, it probably would have cost at least 10 times more than what it cost them to acquire it from us. And by doing that, again, that gives them more available funds to support their agenda. But if they had to use those funds to actually do the development, then it would be a different story. So I think that's another area that we need to work very hard on, and that is to be very hard on them regarding intellectual property.
Well, thank you, John, for that answer. I think you sort of touched on this topic in that last answer a little bit, and I think maybe it's a good follow-up. Obviously, the national debt has been rising dramatically over the last 10, 20 years. What is your answer to solving that potentially looming crisis that we may have as a result of the national debt?
I will answer that two ways, Mike. I think just so everyone, I think most people are aware of this, but just in the last 12 years, the national debt has gone from 9 trillion up to almost 26 trillion. What's that mean a little bit closer to home? Well, back 12 years ago, that meant that every man, woman, and child in the country owed about $35,000 to the government or whoever holds our debt. Now that's ballooned up to 80,000. So if you stop and you think about that, if you're a family of 4, you have a $320,000 debt that at some point will have to be resolved with our debtors. So to your question, how do we go about dealing with that? That's a huge issue. To me, it speaks of a financial crisis that is literally just over the horizon. So how do we deal with that and try to avoid a crisis? I think the only graceful way of doing it, again, trying to avoid a financial crisis that would look like the 2008 financial crisis, and COVID-19 put together on steroids. So I think the only answer is to stop the growth of government spending. Not necessarily totally, as much as I would like to do that, I don't think that is totally feasible. So I think what we need to do on the one hand is cut down dramatically on the size of the growth of government spending. And my proposal calls for limiting that to roughly 0.5% a year instead of the 3, 4, or 6% we tend to see. So on the one hand, quit spending, quit growing the growth of spending. And on the other hand, the more important one is continue to grow good jobs in the economy. And what does that do? Well, as you grow good jobs in the economy, you're bringing in more revenue. So I believe that if we get government off the backs of people, we would actually be able to sustain a 3%, maybe 3.5% growth in our government revenue, in our economy, which translates into our revenue. As we do that, we would very quickly grow ourselves into a balanced budget. And then to your point specifically about the national debt, as we continue that practice and grow into a surplus situation, we could use that surplus to start to pay back the debt. If we do that, I think there will be confidence in the financial markets, and we can keep interest rates from rising unduly high. And by doing that, we can pay this back incrementally. And if we just hold the line on government spending and let the economy continue to grow, we will get into that mode relatively quickly and do so incrementally. Our last point, Mike, is that our economy, while it appears to be very strong and very robust, it still is fragile in some areas. And if our interest rate ticks up very high and too much of our national revenue goes to servicing the debt, there won't be money there to do other important things that we need to do. So we need to continue to grow and tighten down on spending and just not spend the growth of spending that we have typically every year.
Well, thank you, John. Another question I see that we had come in early was, obviously in terms of cutting spending, which is what brings me to this topic, is do you have an opinion on what cities like New York and Los Angeles have done where they voted to actually cut spending for their police departments?
Now that's a timely topic. I actually believe that by cutting spending to their police departments, I think that's ignorant and dangerous. And why do I say that? It's a very difficult environment, especially in the large urban areas. And I believe, and we've seen, that's been the focal point of our discussion the last couple months. I think what we need is more and better law and order, law enforcement. And I don't think you get that by cutting the funding. I think what we ought to be doing are more proactive things. For example, I think we need to do a better examination of some of the methods used, and I think that's taking place right now. I think there also needs to be better, more frequent training to those methods so people respond in the right way. I think those are all critical. So I think instead of defunding the police, I think we need to maintain the funding, but use it in a more intelligent way of preparing them for success. My fear is if we defund the police, and whether it's LA, whether it's New York, or any place else, that's going to result in more lawlessness, more of the dangers that we've been seeing, and quite frankly, the bottom line is more people will be hurt. So that's why I say I think it's ignorant and dangerous, and definitely the wrong path.
Well, thank you, John. I guess we're talking about how the issues surrounding these protests and how defunding the police is going to be a negative on those efforts to calm things down. I guess, one of the questions I have is, what would you say to, the question here is specifically about what would you tell a millennial, but I think what would you tell millennials, but also people in general in our district that would give them hope and encouragement, how things can be better tomorrow than they are today?
Well, I think the millennials, and I hate to talk about large groups in general, but I think it's appropriate. I think millennials have been hit especially hard over this last, I'd say, 12-year period, because as you think about the timeline, they got hit relatively hard with the financial crisis of 2008. And as we came out of that financial crisis, while the economy rebounded over the last decade, it tended to rebound more with service type jobs as opposed to higher order jobs. And then on top of all that, with that background, before COVID ever hit, a lot of the millennials were still living in their parents' basements, still getting support from their families, not really necessarily, paying off student loan debt, all of the above. And then on top of that comes another shock of COVID-19 government lockdowns. They tended to be people that got laid off first, the service jobs went away. So I think they've borne the brunt of this. So that is a backdrop to your question. I think when I talk in terms of security, freedom, and opportunity, I would address that in reverse. First, the millennials need the opportunity. And that's why I continue to pound on the concept of bringing manufacturing back to the United States. Because by bringing manufacturing back, we will grow good jobs in the economy. That will create more and more opportunity for millennials. And keep in mind that that doesn't necessarily mean they all need to go into manufacturing jobs. Quite the contrary. We all know that for every manufacturing job that's created, you actually generate 4 other jobs in the surrounding community. So by really focusing on bringing jobs back to the United States, bringing manufacturing back, that will create an engine that the millennials will be able to benefit from. Now, I'll take a step back to freedom. The other thing I would tell them is stand strong. And what am I talking about? Well, in this day and age, people are just continually pelted by political correctness, the cancel culture, even in many cases, freedom of speech. And I would encourage them to stand strong in the face of that and don't succumb to that. Fight back against that, because opportunity comes with freedom. And many of those forces right now are working to reduce our freedom as opposed to increase it. So the millennials, I would definitely reinforce the fact to stand strong for freedom and don't succumb to the political correctness that has so many people paralyzed and quiet. And then lastly, from a security standpoint, support the law and order. You cannot have a strong civil society that encompasses freedom and opportunity if you have lawlessness. So I think that is very timely. We need to have more people speaking out in support of law and order and doing that right. And I would certainly encourage them to do that, because without that, they're not going to have the freedom. They're not going to have the opportunity to advance in their life. And that's what they need more than anything else right now. Can't hear you. Mike, are you on mute?
I apologize, John. We're going to switch topics a little bit here. In the chat, there's been some questions and general discussion about our education system and how both our children today, as well as if you look at our college age citizens, are not being brought up maybe the same way and taught the same things that we were when we were younger in terms of the greatness of our country, a lot of the good points in our history, and instead focusing on the negative. Do you have any thoughts on that, or anything you feel that the government could do to help increase accountability or to level the playing field, so to speak?
Well, quite honestly, my solution would be the opposite: get government out of education. And what I mean by that is, I think there's two facets of this. One is what's nearest and dearest to my heart is I want to see more local involvement with regard to education. A lot of times people don't stop and think about it, but in most cases, all of us have school boards, and you have 9 people on the school boards. And you have, what that means then is 5 people, if they are of like mind and are cohesive, then they ultimately have a huge amount of power. They have the power to ultimately determine what curriculum is taught to students. They also have the taxing authority. And one of my biggest frustrations is that it's very difficult in many areas to find people to run for and hold school board positions. But ultimately, I think that's what needs to be done. I think we, the people, need to step up, run for school board, win those positions, and by having done that, then we can have a much stronger influence over what is taught to our children and the taxing authority that goes with that. So that's an abstract thought that a lot of people don't think about, but ultimately that's the most straightforward way of doing it. Become active, get on your school board, and have an impact. The other thing, though, I think from a governmental standpoint that I think could have a big difference is school choice. School choice, if done correctly, it would allow parents to make decisions about, especially in urban areas. It would be a little more difficult out here where schools are spread out much further. But especially in urban areas, I think one thing that we need to do just as fast as we humanly can is get school choice into place, so parents can make good decisions about where their kids go to school. Do they send them to a failing school, or do they send them to a school that is actually educating well, educating the things that the parents actually agree with? And by doing that, you would create competition, and you would then give your children an opportunity to get the education you want. And you would also then tend to promote more and more of that. So I do not believe strongly in having a federal mandate that you got to teach this or you have to teach that. because we're already seeing the negative impacts of that. But letting people have the choice through school choice, especially letting the money follow the student, I think that's one of the best ways, along with getting engaged yourself. I think those are some of the best ways of changing this. And by doing that, it changes it organically. It doesn't change it by government mandate.
Thank you, John. Pivoting back to spending and the national debt, obviously, lots of people are concerned about the rising costs of healthcare in general, but particularly around the costs of Medicare and Medicaid, with the increases to the Medicaid program over the years, and the fear that as the debt rises, there'll be less money to spend on healthcare. So I guess, how would you, do you have any thoughts on how we can address that problem?
Yeah, I think there's 2 or 3 things that come to mind. I think first, and maybe one of the easiest, is to get much harder on fraud. I think we've all heard some of the horror stories about how much fraud there is in the Medicare and Medicaid system. There's billions upon billions of dollars that are fraudulently paid out, that I think we need to get much tougher on that and really go after that. And you'd be amazed at how many tens of billions of dollars are being wasted through fraud. So that's one. I think a second one goes back to my point about growing good jobs in the economy, because the stronger the economy is and the better the jobs are for people, then there would be fewer and fewer people that would be on Medicare and Medicaid. So I think that's another one of the many benefits that would be there from a strong, growing economy with really quality jobs. And then a third one that I can think of is the situation where right now today, we waste a lot of money in our healthcare system because we're not proactive enough. And what I mean by that is, if you step back and you look to see where does most of the cost come from in our healthcare system, it's reacting to major medicals. Someone has a heart disease, has a heart attack, they need open heart surgery. They develop diabetes and they end up getting toes cut off and what have you. Even to some degree, various cancers. I think, and I can state this from my own personal experience, if we were to develop and employ a different system or tweak the current system to where we focus more on early detection of issues, and all that really is screenings. You just have people, and you do routine screenings of people and check to see what issues they have. Once you know what issues they have, then make sure they're getting the help they need, whether it's just a lifestyle change, maybe a food choice, or maybe in some cases, prescription drugs are applied, okay, like for hypertension, okay. That's the second piece. And the third piece is actually then working with those folks to make sure they stay on that medication, that they get it and they use it. By doing that, and by avoiding major medicals, you get a double benefit. On the one hand, you get the benefit of lower costs, but more importantly, people then get the benefit of being healthier. So I've been working with a local fellow here over in the Coatesville area who has done a huge amount of work over the last few years. And he estimates that by taking this approach, we could save 20 to 40% of our Medicaid costs. And that, just for example, here in Pennsylvania, that could be $8 billion a year, $8 billion a year if we did this. So now, why am I confident about this? Well, when I was working for a company over in New Jersey, I was asked to be the head of the wellness committee. And we put together a plan that did exactly this. We did a lot of screenings. We found people with high blood pressure, developing sugar issues, etc. We got them help right away. And by doing that, we started to avoid those major medicals. And by doing that, we were able to reduce the cost of healthcare to the company and to people, because we were self-funded. We were able to do that 4 years in a row. So it can be done. And the beauty of it is it's less expensive and better outcomes for people. So if we do all those things, I think we can significantly reduce the cost of Medicare and Medicaid and have those funds available to use elsewhere to other very important needs.
Well, thank you, John. We have a few other questions on government spending and the size of government, but I wanted to pivot to a different topic first. And it's been one that obviously over the last month or so has been a major concern to a lot of people. And the question is, are you concerned about a fair election this November with the potential for mail-in voter fraud or other issues with the mail-in voting system?
Yeah, I'm very concerned, especially I'm concerned about our own district here, the PA6, but I'm actually more concerned about the state of Pennsylvania. So my big concern is I think the issue is that as mail-in ballot was negotiated in Harrisburg and became law, I don't think they necessarily thought through all the different aspects of it and how you would safeguard it. And I think that's where we stand right now today. That's where a lot of people are very apprehensive about it, especially with the bad experiences they had during the primaries. I know I had a bad experience. I tested it myself and the system didn't work right. And I've heard nothing but horror stories since the beginning of June about this. So I also realize right now that there's several entities that are suing the state and bringing this up, and in essence saying we don't have the right system in place and we need to correct these things. So what I would say is I would agree with those people who have brought suit. I think that if they can't absolutely even talk to their process and to show all of us as voters that they have the right safeguards in place, then I think we shouldn't have the mail-in ballots. There's too much of a potential for fraud, and it just it's so critical. This election is going to be so critical, and it's very important for people to feel like their vote is going to be counted. And especially with all the horror stories we have heard across the state coming from the primary experience, we have to do everything we can to make sure that those safeguards are in place. If they're not in place, we don't use the mail-in ballots.
Very good, John. Switching back to some more global issues beyond the Commonwealth. One person has asked, says that you say that you're for free trade. So what is your stance on tariffs at this time?
That's a tough one in a way, and yet it's simple. I am very much a free trade person. I think that is the best system overall. However, I'm also I can accept tariffs, certain tariffs, on a short-term basis. And what that really goes to is if you know that there's an artificial situation that has been created, say, by a particular country. So for example, in the past, we've seen China dumping steel, or we've seen Canada dumping grains or lumber, what have you. If a foreign country is developing an artificial advantage, then I think we ought to be free to use tariffs to level the playing field. Another classic example is, we pay a lot of money in this country for environmental controls. Other countries like China and India don't. And you can tell when you look over there, you can't even see the sun. So, but as a result of that, their goods, it's one of the many reasons why their goods tend to be less expensive. Well, in some of those cases where there is an artificial imbalance in the trade, then I think we can and should use tariffs to help level that playing field. But I think the key point is hopefully that's short term, and that prompts them, and I think we need to work with them to put the right things in place just for the good of the planet in the last example. But I definitely think that we can use tariffs strategically to level the playing field and not put Americans at a decided disadvantage.
Well, that actually segues nicely into another question that we have, talking about the environment. You oftentimes talk about environmental conservation when people are discussing things with you, or if you look at your website, instead of environmental initiatives like the Green New Deal. Why is that, and what do you see as the difference?
I think environmental conservation is one that is far more responsible than something like a Green New Deal or a Paris Accord. And what I mean by that is, with my experience, my lifetime experience with environmental conservation, one, it compared to something like the Green New Deal, it's something that you can do tomorrow. We've been doing this for years upon years upon years. So you can do it tomorrow, and it can actually be more impactful than something like the Green New Deal and more realistic. So for example, there's things that we do every day, every year in manufacturing to reduce our footprint, whether it's reductions of electricity, water usage, materials by reducing scrap. There's things that we do every year, and we do those in a much higher percent reduction than even what the Green New Deal would deliver if it were even possible. And the beauty of it is it doesn't disrupt the system. You do it based on good practices. We all know what those practices are. So as we continue to do that, we get benefit right away, and we don't disrupt the whole world and the whole economy. And the impact is bigger. If you can save 5% electricity every year, as opposed to something that the Green New Deal would not do, then you get that benefit immediately. I think the other thing, I mentioned reality. As people think about things like the Green New Deal, they think in terms of alternate energy. And the Green New Deal calls for an elimination of fossil fuels by 2032, 2035. If you think about where we are today and realism, here we are in 2020. A lot of people may not recognize it, but with all that has been done so far with solar, with wind, etc., that still only represents about 3% of our power usage in the country. So in order for us to eliminate fossil fuels, we would have to double that many times over. And yet over the last 30 or 40 years, we've only grown up to 3. And quite honestly, that 3% has been stable for the last 10 years. So just the reality of switching to that kind of an environment just is not realistic without just an absolute total disruption of the world's economy. And I really think too, from a conservation standpoint, I think we ought to focus more attention on things we can impact today and tomorrow. For example, one that's near and dear to my heart is habitat destruction. We can do something about that right now. We need to be. So let's focus on that. Also, species extinction. Those two things kind of go hand in hand, but let's worry a little bit more about habitat destruction and species extinction, and something quite honestly that the Green New Deal is not realistic in the short term, and tends to be something that's manipulated by power brokers or government. So that's the other reason why not to put too much stock in that, because we're being led around by our nose on many of those topics. And just as a last point, case in point, by us using natural gas now, the way we're using natural gas, we have reduced the carbon footprint more so than what was in the Paris Accord. It's good for the economy, it's good for the environment, it's good for the whole system. And that happened naturally because natural gas was a better option. So that's one good example of how we actually have done better than what a Paris Accord or something else would have had us for in a different way, but we got there. And it was done organically, it was done naturally. That's why I think we ought to focus on that and not on some manipulated New Deal.
Well, thank you, John. I guess switching back to some of these spending questions that I have in front of me, do you support the $4.5 trillion in additional spending that's been passed in the House? Obviously, the $3 trillion HEROES Act, and then the $1.5 trillion in the infrastructure bill.
Yeah, I do not support that at all, and there's a number of reasons. Well, first of all, the CARES Act, $3 trillion for the CARES Act. Most people realize that not even half of that money has been spent yet. Not even half. After all the hoo-ha-ha back in April, half of that money hasn't been spent yet. Whole topic area, but it hasn't, and it's because of how that was done. So then if you look at the HEROES Act, which still has to be taken up by the Senate and so forth, to me, it's more of the same. Now, that's not to say that there may be a couple elements in there that might be beneficial, but I think that was rushed through the House. It's packed with, there's some good things in there, but also many things that really don't go to where the need is. So, until that became much clearer, and we'd be talking about very specific spending items, I would resist it. I would vote against it. Then on top of that, they come up with a $1.5 trillion stimulus, if you will, an infrastructure bill. I think back to the $800 billion shovel-ready stimulus that took place in 2009, and hardly a dollar of that ever made it to a shovel. And I think the same thing would happen here. Now, do I think that we need to do things for our infrastructure? Absolutely. But what I would challenge first is, one, where's all the money that's being collected today? For example, 18 cents of every gallon of gas purchased in this country goes into a fund that's supposed to be used for infrastructure. Where's that money going? And furthermore, I think we need to, it's going back to my point about not increasing just perpetually 3, 4, 6% a year. I think we need to look at repurposing money, similar to what I was talking about with Medicare, Medicaid. I think there's things that need to be done from an infrastructure standpoint, but instead of just adding more money year after year to the budget, let's look to see where we're spending money today, where it's not having an impact, where it's not creating value, and then repurpose it to something like infrastructure projects. That's what I think we need to be doing more of. We're not doing any of that today. We just keep throwing more money on the wheelbarrow every year, and we're not paying for it directly. We only pay for about 80% of it through tax revenues. The other 20% is part of our debt. I think the worst thing that we have done over the last 30 years is continue to grow the national debt. Because when you think about the numbers I mentioned earlier, what are we doing? We are basically putting that huge burden on our kids and grandkids. And I can't think of anything that would be more irresponsible than doing that. And yet that's what we've done. And we continue to do it every year. We have to stop that. We are burdening our kids and our grandchildren with a huge mortgage that they probably will never be able to pay off, and it will create a huge blanket on them as more and more of the national revenue goes to paying debt as opposed to doing something more meaningful.
Thank you, John. I just one follow-up question on that, and then I'd like to spend the last 5 minutes or so of the chat on a couple other questions I've seen on different topics. But what, I guess, in light of this debt and not supporting some of these bills, what proposals would you have for reducing the size of government?
Well, I think one of the things that we need to do is quit feeding it. As I mentioned, right now, we just keep putting more and more on spending, increasing the size of this, putting this program in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think we need to be thinking in terms of how do we quit feeding the government. So one example would be one that would be relatively easy is put a moratorium on federal hiring. If you're not hiring more and more people every year, then you're going to inherently reduce the cost of government. So that's something that can be done relatively easily. It would be relatively painless. In fact, I think it would be totally painless. And over a period of time, we would just continually reduce the size of government. Along with that, I think we need to take a hard look at some of the things that are in our government. One example, one that's probably the most classic, is the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy came in back in, I think it was 1976 under President Carter. I believe that their budget was something on the order of 16 or 18 billion dollars a year. And yet when you look back over that, what would that be now, 44 years? What has the Department of Energy done? They really had very little to do with our energy independence. And I think there's other examples of that where we have departments that may not even be needed or that they are bloated. So I think what would happen if we stopped hiring people and hold back on our spending, people would have to make decisions about if there was a place. In fact, one person called me and said, would you support adding more people to the IRS to go after fraud? And I said, yes, but not to add to the government payroll. I would take people from another department and move them to the IRS and do more value-added work and not do the less value-added work that they were doing in the original department. The last thing I'll mention is I think from a federal government standpoint, I think we need to shift more and more responsibility back to the states. And as you did that, if you did that, you would reduce the size of the federal government. And I am a strong proponent of local and state government. So while that would reduce the size of the federal government, we would have to try to hold the line on state government, but you have more control of that because it's in your own state, and through your voting, you should have more ability to control that. So those are some of the things that we can do. I personally believe, Mike, that in federal government, somewhere between 20 and 40% of the spending is wasted. So I think there's ample opportunity to repurpose money and be able to do really good things without constantly growing the size of the government and more revenue. But you have to be serious about it and dig inside and want to do something about it. That's what we need. We need more people in Washington with a business background who are proven problem solvers, who really want to solve problems and not politicize everything. And if we can do that, we can make a lot of progress on these issues. And that's what I hope to do by being elected in November and going to Washington next January.
Well, thanks for that, John. I'm going to try and pivot to just two more questions based on the time we have left, and two different topics. The first one is, you say that you're pro-life. That could mean a lot of different things to people. What does it mean to you?
Very, very simple. I believe that life is sacred. I think that life is precious. So when I say that I'm pro-life, I believe we need to do everything we can to defend life. I believe that life begins at conception and carries through to natural death. And as I said, I think it needs to be defended all the way along that spectrum. The one thing that I would like to do is to promote more discussion around end of life situations. While we still need to fight for life at the beginning, I think we need to continue to highlight the end of life situations. And why do I say that is I think when people talk about pro-life, they tend to think about the beginning of life, and that's very appropriate. We should. But I'm concerned that there's not enough discussion about end of life situations. And we've seen here recently how the concern is that we tend to devalue life, especially in the aged. So when you look at things that happened during the COVID-19 crisis, and quite honestly may still be continuing, two good examples. Did we really value the life of people living in nursing homes and assisted living? When you have governors who put down an order to send people who they know have COVID-19 back to nursing homes, you really have to question, do they really value life? And did they do everything they could to protect life? And the other example that we've seen is some of our veterans homes and VAs. There's been a number of those that have a high incident rate. Do we really value people as they approach the end of their life? And I think the thing that's very important about that is all of us at some point or another will approach that. And do we want ourselves, I think we do, ourselves and our families making those decisions, or do we want someone else someplace far away, either in the state capitol or in the national capitol, making decisions, policies, and pronouncements that ultimately will determine the availability of healthcare, the quality of healthcare, whether we'll even have access to it or not. I mean, we've seen situations, notably in the last 3 months, where people have died because they did not have a high enough status to either get a ventilator or something else. They couldn't get a certain medication because someone else had a higher priority because they were younger. I think there needs to be a lot more discussion around life in general, and especially end of life situations, because it's not getting the attention it needs now.
Thanks, John. We have a long list of questions that we weren't able to get to today, but I wanted to close on one that I see a few questions around here that I think is important to a lot of people, and that is, what is your stance on the Second Amendment?
Very simple. I believe very strongly that the Second Amendment is the most important amendment. And why do I say that? The Second Amendment, if it wasn't for the Second Amendment, I truly believe that we would not have any of the other amendments by now. It's been 244 years since the Declaration of Independence. I can't do the math, but it's probably 230 some years since the Constitution and the Second Amendment. If it were not for the Second Amendment, I think those other rights would have been taken away from us. And all you have to do is look at some other states, and you see that that's the desire is to control the Second Amendment. Just look neighboring Virginia. So we need to defend our right to bear arms, and I will always fight for that, because that is that's the one thing that protects us ultimately from government tyranny. And you can look around the world, you can see many other circumstances. You can see it in India, you can see it in China. Every place where someone came in and took away people's guns and then totally dominated those people, that's what happens. That's part of human nature. So we have to make sure we keep the Second Amendment, we keep it strong, and make sure that we don't put ourselves in a situation where a government can be tyrannical to what we've seen elsewhere in human history.
Thank you for that answer, John. I think that looking at the clock, we've hit our limit on the day. So I guess I'd invite you to give us any final thoughts you might have here on this great Independence Day. Okay.
Well, again, just thank you for tuning in today. It is a wonderful day. Fantastic. It looks great out there. What I would just also remind everyone is that if you can't join us on a town hall on a Saturday morning, We are putting up the town halls. We do make recordings of each one of these, and we then put that up. We polish it a little bit, then we put it up on our YouTube channel. So if you miss one or want to go back and pick up a point again, all you have to do is go to YouTube and just start typing in Emmons for Congress, and our channel will come up, and you can choose from all of the past town halls as well as other video clips that we have there. So it's a good place to go every once in a while and see what we may have added to it. We are current, so we do have the last two up. And so I think there's probably 6 or 7 different town hall videos that are up there right now. So again, let's have a great weekend. Be safe. I understand that this year the purchase of fireworks is roughly twice as much as normal because there aren't as many fireworks displays around. So we're going to exercise our freedom and do some of those ourselves. So just be very, very careful, remain safe and healthy, and just cherish this day. People don't realize how few other people in the world get to exercise their freedom and to have a constitution that ensures that. So we can't lose sight of that. We need to fight for that every day. That's going to be the primary thing, the primary question on November 3rd is, are we going to continue to cherish that and be able to celebrate it, or are we going down a very much different path? That's what we have to think about over the next 4 months and make that decision in November. So again, thank you very much for joining. Come back next week. And in the meantime, if you do have questions, don't hesitate to shoot them to us via our website. And many of you know how to get me directly. So never be shy. Keep the cards and letters coming. Have a great weekend, folks.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We appreciate you taking some time out of your day. Happy 4th of July. Have a safe and healthy weekend, and happy anniversary, John and Allison. Hope it's a special one.
Thank you very much. You all take care.